Hey guys, let's start with a question that I think is going to sit with you long after this video ends. If a government will not prioritise its own born citizens for housing in their own country, what is the government for? What is the point of it? What is the function of a state that refuses to acknowledge that the people who built it, who paid into it, who were raised in it, have a primary claim on its resources? That is the question we're going to spend this video unpacking, because it goes at the very heart of the crisis of legitimacy in British politics today. The trigger for this video is an interview given by Angela Rayner, the Deputy Prime Minister and Housing Secretary, to the iPaper. In that interview, Rayner was asked about the proposal from Reform UK. The proposal, broadly stated, was that British-born workers should be given priority for social housing, for council housing, for the housing that is funded by the taxpayer and allocated by the state. Rayner's response was to call this idea insulting and divisive. Now, I want you to sit with the two words for the moment: insulting, divisive. The idea that a British-born worker, someone who was born in this country, whose parents were born in this country, who has worked and paid taxes in this country for perhaps decades, should be prioritised for state-funded housing over somebody who arrived in this country 5 years ago. That idea, according to the Deputy Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, is insulting. Insulting to whom exactly? This is what we are going to dig into today, because this is not just a story about the housing policy. This is a story about the complete psychological transformation of the Labour Party, the redefinition of what it means to be British, and the fundamental question of who the state exists to serve. And I am going to argue thoroughly and with evidence that Labour is wrong. Not just wrong in a policy sense, but wrong at a foundational level. Wrong in a way that reveals a party that has completely lost contact with the people it claims to represent. And I am going to introduce you to, or remind you of, a movement called Restore Britain, because I believe that is the answer to this mess we are in, is not found in the current political establishment. It is found in a return to first principles, a return to the idea that Britain belongs to the British, and that a government's first duty is to its own people. Let's begin with the facts. Let's begin with what reform actually proposed, what the current law actually says, and what the housing situation actually looks like on the ground. Reform UK has at various points promoted the idea of prioritising local people and British citizens in housing allocation. Their 2024 Contact with the People introduced commitments to tougher immigration controls and prioritising local people in housing policy. The specific framing of British-born workers has been used in media coverage and in interviews through the precise wording in their formal documents sometimes varies between British citizens, local people, and people who are paid into the system. That distinction matters, and I will come back to it. Now, here is what the current law says about social housing allocation in England. Social housing is governed mainly by the Housing Act of 1996, as amended by Localism Act in 2011. Under this framework, local authorities must have an allocation scheme for who gets social housing. They must give what is called reasonable preference to certain categories of applicants. Those categories include homeless households, people living in overcrowded or insanitary conditions, people who have to move on medical or welfare grounds, and people who face hardship if they had to move to a different area. Councils also have some discretion to set local qualification rules. Since the Localism Act of 2011, councils have had more freedom to set residency requirements and local connection tests. So a council can, in principle, say that you need to have lived in the area for a certain amount of years before you can qualify for their housing register. This is already happening in parts of the country. But here is the critical point. The current system does not allow councils to prioritise on the basis of birthplace or nationality in a blanket way. In fact, doing so would raise serious legal issues under the Equality Act of 2010, because race in that legislation includes nationality and national origins. So a rule that explicitly said British-born people get priority could be challenged as discriminatory on the basis of national origin. Now, many people hearing this will immediately think, so the law itself has been written to prevent the English people from being prioritised in their own country, and that is essentially correct. The legal framework has been constructed in a way that any attempt to explicitly prioritise the native-born population over foreign-born residents, even foreign-born residents who arrived recently, runs the equality law challenges. Let me also address a common misconception, because it is important to be accurate even when the accuracy cuts against the easy narrative. Britain's social housing system is not simply open to anyone who arrives. Many migrants are subject to immigration control and have what is called a no recourse to public funds. This means they cannot access most benefits or social housing. People subject to immigration control are generally eligible for social housing unless they fall into specific exempt categories, such as refugees or people with settled status. So it's not the case that someone who arrives in Britain tomorrow with no status can simply walk into a council flat. That is a factual claim that would be wrong, and I will not make it. But here is where it gets complicated, and here is where Labour's position starts to unravel. Among those who are eligible, the system is designed to allocate based on need, not based on national origin, birthplace, or length of contribution. So you have two eligible households, one British-born family that have been here for generations, and one family that have arrived from abroad and gained eligibility through refugee status or settled status. The system is not supposed to prefer the British-born family simply because they were British-born. It is supposed to assess need. Need is the government principle, not belonging, not inheritance, not the length of national membership. That is the system Angela Rayner is defending, and that is the system I'm going to argue it's fundamentally wrong. Let's talk about the housing crisis itself, because you cannot understand this debate without understanding the sheer scale of the problem. England has approximately 1.2 to 1.3 million households on council house waiting lists. The figure fluctuates depending on the year and the local authority, but it's been consistently over 1 million for years. Temporary accommodation use has reached record levels. In the most recent official statistics, over 100,000 households were living in temporary accommodation, including thousands of children. That's a staggering figure for one of the wealthiest countries in the world. The social housing stock has been shrinking for decades. More than 2 million social homes have been sold under right to buy since the 1980s, and the rate of replacement has been nowhere near as sufficient. New social rent supply has been far below historic post-war levels for years. The government's own affordable housing supply statistics show a persistent shortfall. At the same time, net migration has been at historically high levels. The Office for National Statistics has recorded net migration in the hundreds of thousands annually in recent years. In 2022 and 2023, provisional figures suggested net migration was run at levels unprecedented in modern British history, even if those figures have been revised or come down somewhat since. The cumulative impact of years of higher immigration is a significant increase in population and therefore housing demand. Now, I need to be precise here, because accuracy matters even if where the truth is uncomfortable. Migration is not the sole cause of housing crisis. The crisis is also driven by decades of underbuilding, planning constraints, right to buy stock losses, changes in household formation, wage stagnation relative to rents, and financialisation of housing as an asset class. Anyone who tells you it's all about immigration is oversimplifying, but anyone who tells you immigration has no effect on housing demand is lying. Both things can be true. The housing crisis is structurally rooted in policy failures over the decades, and mass migration adds significant pressure to an already broken system. The Migration Observatory at the University of Oxford has found that recent migrants are disproportionately represented in the private rented sector, not in social housing. Most migrants, especially recent arrivals, rent privately. This is an important fact. It means that the direct competition for social housing between British-born families and very recent migrants is not as simple as some narrative suggests, but it also means that the pressure from migration flows through the entire housing system. If migrants enter a private rented sector in large numbers, that drives up private rents, which pushes more British families into housing need, which puts more pressure on the social housing waitlist. The system is interconnected. You cannot isolate one part of it and say migration only affects the private sector, so it does not matter for social housing. It all matters. So we have a situation where over 1 million households are waiting for social housing, where temporary accommodation is at record levels, where the stock has been shrinking for decades, and where population growth is driven by migration is adding demand to an already overstretched system. In that context, the question of who gets priority is not an academic debate. It is a question that affects real lives, real families, and real communities. And in that context, Angela Rayner says that prioritising British-born workers is insulting. Now let's turn to the philosophical question, because this is where the real betrayal lies. This is where we need to understand how Labour arrived at its position and why it represents a fundamental break from the party's historical purpose. The Labour Party was founded in the 1900s as the Labour Representation Committee. It emerged from trade union, socialist societies, and working class organisations. Its historic purpose was to give organised labour a political voice. It was the party of the British working class, not a global working class, not a theoretical working class, but the actual, specific, historically situated British working class. The miners, the factory workers, the dockers, the railwaymen, the nurses, the teachers, the people who built this country's infrastructure and kept its essential services running. The post-war Labour government under Clement Attlee created the modern welfare state. The NHS expanded social housing, the welfare safety net. These were built on a principle that was universalist in one sense but national in another. The principle was if you live in Britain, you need healthcare. You get it regardless of the ability to pay. That is universalism. But the principle was also this is a system built by and for the people of Britain. It is a national system. It is not a global system. It is funded by the British taxpayers for British residents. This is a national residential universalism. The NHS is a classic example. Founded on the principle of care according to need, not ability to pay, but founded for the people of Britain, not for the people of the world. This is a difference, and that difference is the entire point of this debate. Now, Labour has always had tensions on immigration and national identity. Labour governments passed race relation legislation in 1965, 1968 and 1976 to combat racial discrimination, but Labour governments have also passed immigration restriction legislation. The Commonwealth Immigrations Act of 1968 was passed by Harold Wilson's Labour government, restricting the entry of the rights of certain Commonwealth citizens. Labour has always balanced two instincts: protect the domestic working class and uphold anti-racist and universalist principles. But that balance has shifted dramatically over the past few decades, and this is where the story gets important. By the 2000s, and especially the 2010s, Labour's electoral coalition has transformed. The party increasingly drew support from university graduates, public sector professionals, ethnic minority communities, large cities, young voters, and socially liberal voters. The old industrial working class base, particularly in the post-industrial working towns in the Midlands, the North, and Wales, began to drift away. This is well documented in electoral research. The British election study and numerous academic analysis have tracked this realignment. The reasons are complex. Brexit played a role, deindustrialisation played a role, cultural values changed, education levels rose, the country became more diverse, but the result was that Labour's understanding of who the working class actually is fundamentally changed. In the old Labour framework, working class meant something specific. It meant British industrial workers, council tenants, trade union members, people rooted in specific communities with specific histories. In the modern Labour framework, working class or working people means essentially anyone who works for wages and is not wealthy. It is a category that has been broadened to include anyone in employment, regardless of how long they've been in the country, regardless of their national origin, regardless of their historical connection to Britain. If you are born in Britain and have worked for 50 years as a mechanic, you are working people. If you arrived in Britain 5 years ago and work as a delivery driver, you are also working people. In Labour framework, these people are in the same category. They have the same political standing. They have the same deserving of the state's attention and resources. Now, I want to be clear about something. I'm not arguing that migrant workers are less than human or they should be treated cruelly. What I am arguing is that there is a difference between a universal moral obligation to treat all human beings with dignity and a specific political obligation that a state has to its own citizens. These are two different things, and the Labour has conflicted them. The state's obligation to its own citizens is not the same as the general moral obligation we all have to be decent to other human beings. A government is not a charity. A government is not an NGO. A government is the institutional expression of a particular political community. Its first duty is to the people who constitute that community. That's not xenophobia. That's not racism. That's the basic logic of what a state is. If a state does not have a primary duty to its own citizens, then the concept of citizenship is meaningless, and the state itself is meaningless. Labour has lost sight of this, and the reason is their commitment to what they call civic universalism. This is the idea that Britain is not a historic nation with particular people, a particular culture, and a particular history, but rather a set of institutions and values that anyone can join. In this view, Britishness is civil identity. It is a passport, a set of laws, and a commitment to certain values. Anyone can become British by meeting certain legal requirements, passing a test, or pledging allegiance to the Crown. There is a version of this that sounds reasonable. Of course people can neutralise. Of course a country can have citizens who were born elsewhere. Of course someone... In an era of mass immigration, can a commitment to universalist ideas take a political party away from its fundamental purpose to represent its existing population? When you operate under the idea that anyone can become British, do you not risk creating a permanently open-ended definition of being British? A definition that has no core, no boundary, no limit? Think about it this way. If Britishness is purely civic, purely a matter of paperwork and values, then there is no theoretical limit to how many people can become British. There is no point at which you can say, we are full, or this is enough, or this is our country, we need to look after our own first, because every new arrival who meets the criteria is just as British as someone whose family have been here for 1,000 years. And if they are just as British, then they have just as much claim to on the housing list, on the NHS, on the welfare system, on everything. This is the logical endpoint of Labour's position. If you cannot prioritise British-born workers for housing, it is because you do not believe that being British-born gives you a special claim on any British resources. You believe that British resources belong to anyone who qualifies under the rules, and the rules should be based on need and not belonging. This is a coherent philosophical position. I'm not saying it is incoherent. I'm saying that it is wrong. It is wrong because it treats a nation as if it was a service provider with no particular obligation to any particular group of people. It is wrong because it dissolves the bond between a state and its historic population. And it is wrong because in a world of finite resources, it guarantees that the existing population will see its share of resources decline as the eligible population grows. Let's look at what a British-born priority rule would actually mean, and why Labour's objections to it is not as straightforward as they seem. First, there is a distinction between British-born and British citizen. A strict British-born test would exclude some British citizens. It would exclude people who are born abroad to British parents, such as children of military families born on overseas postings. This is why I think the better framing is not British born, but national preference or national priority. The principle should be the British state has a primary obligation to British citizens, and particularly those who have deep roots in this country, and that this obligation should be reflected in how scarce public resources are allocated. Second, there is the legal challenge. Under the Equality Act 2010, race includes colour, nationality, and ethnic or national origin. A rule that explicitly prioritised British-born people over foreign-born people could be challenged as discrimination on the basis of national origin. This is a real legal obstacle, but it is not an insurmountable one. Parliament can legislate, Parliament can amend the Equality Act, Parliament can create exceptions for social allocation. The question is whether there is political will to do so. Third, there is the question on whether local connection rules already solve the problem. Labour's defenders would argue that councils can already set residency requirements and local connection tests. If the concern is that people should not be pushed to the back of the queue, councils already have tools to address that, but local connection rules operate within a framework that still prohibits discrimination on the basis of nationality. A local connection test says you need to have lived in the area for a certain period. It does not say you need to be British born, so a foreign born person who has lived in the area for a required period will qualify under local connection test, while a British born person who has recently moved to the area might not. This is not national priority, this is residential priority. They are different things. Now let me address the core of Labour's objection directly, because I think this reveals something important about their worldview. Labour calls the idea of British-born priority divisive. What that word actually means in this context, it means that Labour believes that they're drawing a distinction between British-born citizens and foreign-born residents creates social diversion. It pits groups against each other, it fosters resentment, it undermines social cohesion. But here is the counter-argument, and I think it is devastating. This division already exists. The division is not created by someone pointing out that British-born workers are not being prioritised. The division is created by the material reality that British-born workers are on the waiting list for years while they watch the resources being allocated to others. The division is being created by systems that treat the legitimate desire of a population to be prioritised in its own country and as a form of bigotry. When Angela Rayner calls this idea insulting, she's not preventing division, she's deepening it. She is telling a significant portion of the population that their feelings of attachment to their own country, their sense that they have a special claim on its resources, and not just wrong but morally repugnant, that does not create unity, it creates alienation. It tells people that their own government views them as a problem to be managed rather than a constituency to be served. And this brings me to the deeper question of what has happened to Labour Party's relationship with the working class. Labour still claims to represent working people. The party's rhetoric is full of references to working families and working people, but the meaning of those terms have been hollowed out. When Labour says working people, It does not mean what it meant in 1950 or 1970 or even 1990. It means a broad, omnivorous category that includes anyone who is not a capitalist employer. The specific, particular, historical rooted British working class has been replaced by a universal, abstract, deterritorialised category of workers. This is why Labour can say with a straight face that prioritising British-born workers is divisive, because in their framework, the British-born worker and the migrant worker are the same. They are both working people. To distinguish between them is, in Labour's view, to introduce an arbitrary and morally unjustified distinction. But it is not arbitrary. In the most fundamental distinction in politics, it is the distinction between the citizen and the non-citizen, between the member and the non-member, and between the person who belongs and the person who has arrived. Every functioning political community in its history has drawn this distinction. The idea that drawing it is divisive is the idea that political communities should not exist, that borders should not exist, and citizenship should not carry any material meaning. That is the logical endpoint of Labour's position, and it is a position that the British public is increasingly rejecting. Now, I want to talk about the movement that I believe offers a way out of this mess. It is called Restore Britain, and I want to be clear about what it is and why it matters. Restore Britain is not just another political label, it is a philosophical framework. It is a set of principles that start from the most basic, common sense proposition in politics, that Britain belongs to the British, and that a British government's first duty is to the British people, not to the global workforce, not to the abstract category of humanity, not to the international institutions or universalist ideas, to the British people. The principles of Restore Britain are straightforward, and they stand in direct opposition to the civic universalism that has captured the Labour Party and to a significant extent the Conservative Party as well. First, national preference. Restore Britain holds that the British state should explicitly and unapologetically prioritise British citizens in the allocation of public resources. This means social housing, it means healthcare, it means welfare, it means education, it means any resource that is funded by the British taxpayers and administrated by the British state. This default position should be that British citizens come first, and that any deviation from the default needs to be justified by extraordinary circumstances, not treated as the norm. Second, the recognition that Britishness is not a legal status. It is a historical, cultural, and communal identity. It is something you inherit, something you grew into, something that is rooted in a particular place and a particular history. The core of the nation is the people who were born here, raised here, and whose families have been here for generations. That core has a primary claim on the nation's resources. That is not exclusion, that is basic logic of what a nation is. Third, the end to global subsidy. For too long, the British taxpayer has been funding a system that treats the entire eligible population of the world as political claimants on British resources. The no recourse to public funds rule exists, but is riddled with exceptions. The asylum system grants eligibility, the settled status grants eligibility, the family reunion system grants eligibility, and once somebody is eligible, the system treats them identical to someone whose family has been here since the Norman Conquest. Restore Britain says this has to stop, not because we are cruel, not because we hate anyone, but because a system that tries to serve everyone ends up serving no one, and the people who lose out first are always the one at the bottom of the existing social hierarchy, which in Britain means the native working class. Fourth, community sovereignty. Restore Britain believes in localism, but a localism that is grounded in national identity. Local councils should have the power to prioritise residents with deep ties to the area, not just local connection in a bureaucratic sense. but a real recognition that a family has lived in a town for 4 generations has a stronger claim on that town's resources than someone who moved there last year. That is not radical. That's how every functioning community in history is operated. It is only in the past few decades that we've decided that treating newcomers identically to long-standing residents is the only moral option. Fifth, and perhaps most importantly, the rejection of the moral framework that labels national preference as divisive or insulting. Restore Britain rejects the idea that wanting your own country to put you first is a form of prejudice. It is not prejudice. It is the most basic political instinct there is. It is the instinct that says, this is my home, and my government should look after me and my family before it looks after anyone else. Every other government in the world operates on this principle. The British government is one of the few that pretends it does not, and the result is a population that has lost faith in its own institutions. Let me anticipate some objections, because I know they are coming. The first objection is that a national preference policy would be legally impossible under current equality law, and that is partially true. The Equality Act of 2010, as it stands, would make a blanket British-born first rule very difficult to implement. But the answer is that not to abandon the principle. The answer is to change the law. Parliament is sovereign. Parliament can amend the Equality Act to create exceptions for housing allocation. Parliament can legislate to establish national preference as a guiding principle of public resource allocation. The legal obstacle is real, but it's a policy choice, not a law of nature. It can be changed if there is political will. The second objection is that national preference would damage social cohesion. This is Labour's main argument, but as I have already argued, the damage to social cohesion is already happening. It is happening because people feel that their own country does not belong to them. It is happening because the social contract has been broken. Telling people they are divisive for wanting to be put first in their own country does not create cohesion. It creates resentment. The way to create cohesion is to restore the social contract, to make people feel that the system works for them and that the government has their back. National preference is not a threat to social cohesion. The absence of national preference is. The third objection is that many migrant workers do essential jobs in Britain. They work in NHS, in social care, in agriculture, and in construction. That is true, but the fact that somebody does an essential job does not mean they should have the identical access to all public resources as someone whose family has been here for generations. You can value someone's contribution, pay them fairly for their work, and treat them with dignity, while still maintaining that the nation's scarce housing stock should be allocated with a preference for the nation's own people. They are not contradictory positions, they are positions of every sane country in the world. Let me now bring this back to the housing question, because this is where the philosophy meets the pavement. The allocation of council housing is where universalist ideas meet a sticky conundrum. Labour is now in control of a finite set of resources, while adhering to the belief that Britain's resources should be allocated without reference to national origin or birthplace. The result is a system that is institutionally incapable of saying British people come first, and because it cannot say it, it will continue to alienate the very population it claims to serve. The housing waiting list will keep growing, the temporary accommodation numbers will keep rising, the social housing stock will keep shrinking relative to demand, and every time someone suggests that British-born workers should be prioritised, the response from the establishment will be the same: divisive, insulting, racist. But here is what I want you to understand. That response is not a rebuttal, it is a confession. It is a confession that the people making it have no answer to the legitimate grievance of the British working class. They have no answer because their entire philosophy prevents them from giving one. If you believe that British resources should be allocated without preference to a national belonging, then you cannot justify prioritising British people for anything. You are trapped by your own universalism, and the people who are trapped are not the ones suffering the consequences. The people suffering the consequences are the families on the waiting lists, the children in a temporary accommodation, the pensioners who cannot get a ground floor flat, the young couples who cannot afford to rent privately and cannot get a council home. Labour will tell you that the answer is to build more homes. And yes, building more homes is part of the answer, but building more homes takes time. And even if you build them, the question of who gets them remains. If you build 1 million new council homes tomorrow, the question is still, who's the first to get one? Who gets the best one? Who gets the one in the area where their family lives? Labour's universalism has no answer to that, except need. And need, as defined by the system, does not include, I was born here, my family's been here for generations. That is not a category in the needs assessment. It should be. This is why Restore Britain matters. It matters because it is the only movement that is willing to say what everyone outside the Westminster bubble already knows, that a country which does not prioritise its own people is not a country at all. It is an administrative zone, it is a service provider, it is a hotel. And Britain should not be a hotel. Britain should be a home for the British people. A home where, if you are born here and you work here and you contribute here, you are not treated as one option among many. You are treated as the primary concern of the government. You are treated as the reason the government exists. This is what Restore Britain is about. It is about restoring the most basic relationship in politics, the relationship between a government and its own people. It is about saying clearly and without apology that the British state exists for the British people, and that any policy that subordinates the interests of the British people to the interests of the others is a failure of the state's fundamental duty. Angela Rayner called the idea of British-born housing priority insulting. I'll tell you what is actually insulting. What is insulting is a deputy prime minister who rose through the ranks of a party that was built by the working class, who now tells the same working class that they have no special claim on their own country's resources. What is insulting is a housing secretary who presides over a system that houses over 100,000 households in temporary accommodation, including children, and whose response to a proposal to prioritise the native population is to call it divisive. What is insulting is a political class that's overseen the sale of more than 2 million social homes, the stagnation of social house building, and the importation of millions of new residents, and then tell the people who have been here all along that they are the problem for noticing. Labour is wrong on this. Not just technically wrong, not just rhetorically wrong, but philosophically wrong at the deepest level. They are wrong because they have replaced the national social contract with a globalist abstraction. They are wrong because they have redefined working class in a way that includes the entire world and excludes the claims of inheritance and belonging. They are wrong because they have made it impossible for the British state to do one thing it must do: look after its own. The path forward is not complicated in principle, even if difficult in practice. It requires a willingness to change the law. It requires a willingness to face down the accusations of racism that will inevitably come. It requires a willingness to say that the British people are not the problem to be managed, but a community to be served. It requires, in short, the courage to restore Britain. If you agree with what I said in this video, I want you to think about what you can do. Share this with somebody who needs to hear it. Talk to your family, your friends, your neighbours about what is happening, because the media will not cover this honestly, the establishment will not debate this fairly. The only way this message spreads is person to person, community to community. And if you are watching this and you've been on the housing waiting list, or know somebody who has, or have watched your community change beyond recognition while politician tells you that noticing is divisive, then you already know what I'm saying is true. You do not need me to tell you more. You are living it. It is time to stop apologising for wanting a home in your own country. It is time to stop accepting the label of divisive for wanting your government to put you first. It is time to restore the basic principle that Britain belongs to the British, and the British government's first and last primary duty is to its own people. This is what this debate is really about. Not housing, not allocation formulas, not waiting list statistics. It's about whether Britain is a nation or an administrative zone, whether the British people are a community or a demographic, where the British state has a purpose or just a process. Restore Britain says it is a nation, the British people are a community, and the British state has a purpose. The purpose is to serve the British people. Everything else is secondary. And if that is divisive, then count me in.